So I'm here to talk about the great books, and the great books as a curriculum of study as part of formal education, not the great books as some sort of shimmering collection of monumental works that we're to admire as standing for all time. Although you could do that if you wanted to, and they certainly, for the most part, deserve it. But I also don't want to make a fetish out of the great books. I want to think of this in terms of what it means to structure education around the reading and discussion of great books, of whatever we want to call them, really good books, classic texts, core texts. There are a lot of different ways, terms that people use. But we'll stick to great books because that's what we're all used to. It is part of Torrey. It's a central part of what Torrey is about. And Torrey, I think, partly does derive the idea, the practice from this movement that Dr. Wright described that's been going on for just about a century now. And actually, that's actually not very long when you think about it. For this, it isn't as if for instance, time immemorial, people have been reading Plato, Aristotle, and so on, and it just happens in the last few years. There are more of them are doing it. It's what I want to do. I'm a historian by training, and I want to trace out some of the large contours of this in the history of education without, I hope, boring you to death, because the history of education can be a pretty boring subject. And but first, I want to declare a personal interest, as they say, which has already been alluded to in my introduction. I'm a part of this, and I'm going to try to speak analytically as best I can. I just realized I'd left my phone on. It's going to result in something very embarrassing. My ringtones are pretty strange. So I will be analytical, but also personal at times by turn, and so I hope that will make sense to you. The personal angle is that I went to St. John's College, which is often held up as the exemplar of this tradition. In some ways, and I kind of got into this in dinner tonight with my colleagues here, in some ways I think actually you may be better positioned now to have that kind of leadership. But I'll just say a little bit, tantalizing little bit about that at the end. But St. John's is seen as the gold standard when it comes to great books programs. It was established in 1937, the so-called new program, which is now not so new, but that's what we all still call it, the new program, and has been going strong ever since then. I went there in the 70s. Both of my kids went there, I have continued to stay involved as an alumnus, and then I was coaxed into joining the board, which I served on for several years. So I'm pretty mobbed up with St. John's, as they say. In my family, my poor wife is the only one in the family who has no St. John's experience. So we rely on her for sanity, and she kind of gets stamps on the envelopes and things like that. I know what you're thinking. What are envelopes? What are stamps? I never heard of these things. So I have all these connections to St. John's, and it was really the place that I had my initial intellectual formation. So I believe in the way they do things, not uncritically, not unqualifiedly, and I'll talk about some of the things I see that are drawbacks, not necessarily things that can be changed, because you can't do everything. And doing X may mean you can't do Y, but you can't necessarily do both X and Y at the same time. But I do believe in the way of doing things. I believe in the building of the program around the great books But as you'll see, there's a lot more to St. John's than just the great books, and there's a lot to be learned from that fact. It's a tremendous source of commonality with my own children. You know, it's not many people who can say that they can have a discussion at the drop of a hat with their children about the Odyssey or any number of Shakespeare plays or Ptolemy's Almagest or Newton's Principia or any number of the other books that we all three have read and studied at St. John's. So it's a terrific sort of family unity builder, and my wife is always anxious to learn, so she listens to us lecture her about this is what this book says, and oh yeah, very good, okay. So once again, she comes to the rescue as the voice of sanity. But and there's a lot to be said there just for having those commonalities. It's great when the commonalities are also great books, but having common experiences is an important part of the experience of education, particularly in a college like this one. I mentioned a historian. My training, that's where when I went to graduate school, I went to Johns Hopkins to study history. And Johns Hopkins is actually, will pop up a little bit later in this lecture as a somewhat a villain along the way. But I had a reasonably good experience. I got my degree. Graduate school is not nearly as much fun as college. If you haven't been told that, consider yourself as having been told. It's a sort of pre-professional experience. But anyway, one of the things I did was I learned to think like a historian. And one of the things historians are very concerned about is the context of events. So if you're studying books or thinkers or writers or musicians or celebrities, any kind of individual, to fully understand them, you want to look at the context of the times in which they were living. What sorts of events were going on in the world? What sorts of currents of thought and tastes are active in influencing their time? And we didn't do that at St. John's. We didn't read the great books as having had any particular historical context. We didn't learn about what Plato might have been involved in terms of the Athenian politics of his time. We did learn a whole lot about Machiavelli's Machiavellian machinations in his time, the context of his work. But my favorite example of my own ignorance, and I think I can blame St. John's and maybe my own lack of curiosity for this. We read a book, some of you will know, by Thomas Hobbes called Leviathan. Yeah, everybody's favorite. And of course, I love the line, about how the state of nature is, under Hobbes, is so bleak, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, which I've always thought of as a title for a law firm, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish. And it's a very haunting book. It's I think, for Christians, a rather challenging book in a lot of ways, and I didn't like it much. One of the things I never really realized about it was the context in which it was written. And in a conversation one day, not long after I graduated, I was talking about how much I didn't like Hobbes. And Leviathan was published in 1651. Some of you may know that there were some things going on at that time. There was an English Civil War going on. And I sort of knew that. And I knew that the book had been published in 1651, but I somehow didn't connect the things. That a book like the Leviathan, which clearly comes out of a deathly fear of anarchy and civil war. Civil war is the worst kind of anarchistic experience that can befall people. And no wonder he was so concerned with order and with restoring some kind of reliable sovereignty in the leadership of the political class. So we never learned anything about the context in which Hobbes wrote Leviathan at St. John's. So that's a little bit of a drawback, particularly if you're a historian. You sort of learn the context we may overemphasize context, but we're right to emphasize it somewhat. Also, there's no, for lack of a better term, there's no larger narrative at St. John's that holds the books all together. So, and there's a strong human need to provide a meta-narrative, a larger narrative, a larger structure of meaning within which all of these books that you're reading make sense and sort of build towards some end. St. John's doesn't do that. It mainly teaches you, and I like this, and the Gordon Wood quotation that he read reflects this about me, that I really don't like the view of the past that we often take of condescending to it and treating the past as something only worthy of our contempt. And that we are living in the age of ultimate truths, and that we can pat ourselves on the back for being so smart. There's a bit of that at St. John's. There's a bit of a sort of lament over the decline, the declension of modernity, that by moving into the modern world, we gave up something precious that the ancient world understood, a commitment to virtue, to sort of civic activity, and reverence for nature, for the elements. That we gave up these things in order to conquer nature and become sort of masters of our own fate. And that's a useful kind of agnosticism or skepticism to throw into the minds of modern young people, some skepticism about modernity itself. But by and large, there's no overarching narrative. I think there is here, by the way. I mean, there is the Christian story, which doesn't necessarily track with the events of history, but is nevertheless a kind of container for everything you're doing here. And that's another way why I think that maybe the next phase in the evolution of the great books idea might well take place in Christian institutions. There are lots of ways of doing great books, too. There are institutions all over the country that do them to a greater or lesser extent. The St. John's way, though, is interesting, and I want to talk to you about this a little bit because it may be different. I think it is different from what you do here. At St. John's, the seminar, and all the classes are seminars of one sort or another, including the language tutorials and other things. But the seminar, the place where you read the great books for the most part, is very non-directive. There are faculty members who sort of sit at opposite ends of the table and they'll ask an opening question, and then it's up to the students to carry the entire discussion for 2 hours. And you imagine at first people, what do I do? And you have all kinds of things being blurted out, and then people yelling at one another, and they don't know how to have a conversation. And so the first few weeks of the freshman year are pretty wild, but eventually people learn how to do this. You just have to let it go, and they will eventually learn how to swim. So it's that, but it's also that at St. John's you confront these books without guardrails. You confront them without lots of editorial annotations, without a lot of scholarly prefixes and preludes and packaging. Like, now, okay, you're going to be reading Homer's Iliad now, but let me tell you this you need to understand this about his language, you need to understand this about what we think about the conditions under which it was composed, and all the latest scholarship about. No, we didn't do any of that. We just plunged into the book. And in fact, we were advised not to read the editorial introductions. They would only, interfere with our experience of the book. Which, there was a strain in me that thought, this is kind of strange. But that's what we did. And that's what they still do. You plunge into the story without guardrails, without aids, reading aids, and you learn to treat the text as to some extent self-contained. It has a wonderful leveling effect on, because it doesn't matter what you come into the room with, whether you went to the best school, prep school in the Northeast, or some crummy high school that ought to be razed. If you can read, if you can add 2 and 2, you can probably do the work at St. John's. It is that leveling effect that's one of the wonderful things about the seminar, because all you need to be able to be at the table is to have read the book that everybody else has read. I told this story today to the faculty. I hope you won't mind me repeating this, but the first seminar I went to at St. John's was on the Iliad, Homer's Iliad. And by the way, I mean, just reading the first 5 books of the Iliad that way was such a trip for me. Because I had been trained to always listen to, what the scholars said about how I should filter all of this in advance. And I didn't do that. I followed instructions and read it as if it was written for me. Not in a narcissistic way, but in the sense that nothing that any mediator was going to do was going to improve my experience, that I had to just do it for myself. And it was fantastic. It made the thing come alive for me. I probably misunderstood a great many things at the time, but that's part of the method. The point is to learn to approach the book with respect, with the kind of, and there's a disposition that's a little bit like, I'm not going to take this comparison too far, but it's a little bit like, you know where I'm going, I can tell, your disposition towards Scripture. If you're in a Bible study, you don't approach it. If you're a believer, you don't approach it in the terms of, well, I don't know whether I agree with Paul about this. No. What is this saying? What does this mean? How does this speak to me? What can this book teach me? What is it teaching? What is it saying? Am I hearing what it's saying? That's the disposition you begin with. And that's the premise of the whole program. Is you don't come in saying, this is the stupidest thing I've ever read in my life, right? Which is what I get all the time from my students. No, the premise of a great books program is say, these are great books. So before you criticize them, you better make sure you really understand them and can parse them and explain what the book is saying. The story I was going to tell is that in that first seminar, we had a student who'd had one of those excellent prep school educations in the class, and he was dressed in a perfect tweed jacket and bow tie, kind of like other people we know. And although you left your tweeds at home tonight, I see, but. And just perfectly sort of turned out in this sort of nerdy, preppy way, and he waited a sort of decent interval, and then he came and said, "Well, we have to understand the conditions under which these were composed," and he went into this very learned disquisition about how we know that these Homeric poems were the product of oral tales that were told for years and years by the shepherds of the region, southeastern Europe and Turkey, and that over time, redactors appeared who recorded them into texts, and then this and that and that and that, and we all sat there kind of like taking it in, and he stopped. Sort of as if, okay, now you know everything you need to know about Homer. And there was a long pause, a long silence. And then the discussion just began exactly where it was when he had come in. Nobody had any use for what he had said, because what we were doing, we were engaging the book directly in the way that any person, even with zero educational background, coming into the room, who'd read the book carefully, you had to read carefully, but who'd read the book carefully, would do. So, and that's, I think, the essential feature of St. John's approach to great books. It entails some interesting things. Remember, I said the students lead the discussion. So, a lot of times you'll be sitting there and things will be getting off onto a weird track. Like Achilles is a homicidal maniac. He's mentally ill or something. No, he's not mentally ill. You're just imposing, present-day values on him. Actually, there's evidence in the text that he's esteemed. But and so back and forth about that. But it's all based on the text. Nobody's inventing anything, bringing in anything external, this sort of godly knowledge about how the oral poetry tradition worked. No, it's all limited by what everybody has access to in the room, and that is a great text. So I once observed a St. John's seminar as part of a group that I was working for as a consultant. That was thinking about bringing these seminars to their organization. And they wanted to have me as a sort of guide to explain what these strange tribes were doing. So we sat through a seminar, and on the way out, one of the people in the committee was this professor at Emorys, the English professor, just burst out. She said, this was the most god-awful thing I've ever been through in my life. And, why didn't the professor intervene and correct the students when they were saying X, Y, or Z? And I said, you don't understand. That's not, the point of this is not that people will learn the correct view of Kant's Metaphysics of Morals, a foundation of the Metaphysics of Morals, which was what we were reading. That's not the point. The point is to give them the occasion to exercise their independent intellect and test it against the independent intellects of other people around the table, without professors coming in, swooping in and saying, well, that's right, that's wrong. And by the time people have done this for half a year or so, they get the hang of it. It takes a little while, but they get the hang of it, and they learn intellectual self-reliance. They learn not to be intimidated by big, important books that say, well, I am great on their covers. They feel they can tackle anything, and generally they can. So this is, again, one of the things that's really terrific about a great book's curriculum done in that way, is that you're learning self-reliance, you're learning to run the discussion yourself, you're learning to rely on the authority that your use of your own reason and your discursive skills with others give you. You're not relying on the professor to come in and pat you on the back and on the head and say, that's correct, son, you did well. So it's very independent in a way. Okay, I said I'd talk about the history a little bit. I'm going to try to do this quickly without anyone, if I hear snoring, I'll change the subject. But make broad generalizations. So, first of all, there's always a conflict in American higher education, and really education on all levels, between, on the one hand, what might be called the liberal or general, and liberal does not mean politically liberal necessarily. It doesn't exclude that, but general education, and practical or vocational education on the other hand. And you're going to see that duality running through this very quick overview. Starting in the colonial period, so we're talking about back the 17th century, basically. You have, and in fact, the first American college was Harvard, founded in 1636, which is a long time ago, to have a college exist all that time. Basically, what they studied were classical languages and divinity, that is theology with a view towards the ordained ministry, because the Puritans, the Puritans had just arrived at Massachusetts Bay 6 years before, and but they felt very strongly that for their community they needed to have a learned clergy. That was essential, a learned clergy, and they didn't want to have to import people from Cambridge or abroad to do it. They wanted to grow their own. So that's why they created Harvard, to really generate their ministers. And other people went there too, but the program was classical languages and divinity and a few other, little bit of math, a few other things, but odds and ends, but basically that. And the interesting thing is they didn't study classical languages with a view towards the mastery of them to read classical texts, except, to read the New Testament in Greek, that kind of thing. But they read them for the rigor. Those of you who studied Latin know what I'm talking about. I mean, it is a rigorous kind of enterprise. It builds mental discipline in those who study. That's what they liked. They wanted this disciplining effect of classical languages. So it really didn't have any particular utility value except in producing discipline. And that which they saw as a kind of moral formation. Really, the early colleges were divinity schools, they were seminaries, they were places that were concerned with the formation of people for the ministry. They were concerned with moral formation. As you move into the early national and antebellum years, the years before the Civil War, this broadens out a little bit into a broader notion of moral formation. There's still a lot of emphasis on classical languages. And I have a story. I read this to the faculty, and they loved it so much. I'll read it to you. This is a story about Princeton. This is in the 1840s, so it's pretty far along. And it's about a contretemps that erupted over a teacher who was of classical languages who was incorporating classical literature into the teaching. And listen to this. When word reached Princeton Vice President John McClay that Professor Topping was teaching Greek literature rather than the Greek language, he at once called him to account. Topping replied he used literature as a means to an end in order to interest the students in their work. After years of futile attempt by the familiar method of teaching in which he was often interrupted by groans and other wild sounds, that's a quote, he began to intersperse the translation and parsing with comments on the passages of literature that attracted his attention. And the students were transformed. Far from being unruly and apathetic, they now were studious. We must succeed, said the teacher, Mr. Topping, who's about to get topped. We must succeed, it seems to me, by interesting the understanding of the students and rousing a manly interest of thought and then turning them back upon themselves. Well, this was heresy. And that it was rank heresy, we may conclude, I read here, from the fact that a few days later, Topping's resignation was accepted by the trustees. He was asked to leave because he was adulterating his instruction in Greek by including little snippets of Greek literature to, spice it up. And you thought school was boring now. So there was this problem that a lot of rote memorization of the classical languages without any kind of textual admixture with it, with one exception. In this time, some of the Roman writers, Livy, Cicero, people who were admired by the founders, the American founders, for their commitment to civic virtue, were part of the reading. And the goal was to build a more patriotic, more informed American citizenry. So that became part of the antebellum curriculum. Okay, so that's where things stood. Classical languages, not much Greek texts anyway, a few citizenship, civics-oriented Roman texts, and a kind of general culture in the sciences and mathematics, but nothing too deep or specific. After the Civil War, this all changed, and that's sort of, in a way, we're still living with some of the changes that occurred. You have really three changes. The land-grant universities, in some ways the least important of the change, but the development of the large state universities, which were built on land that the federal government granted for the use of educational institutions. So Ohio University, California has a bunch of land-grant institutions. Ohio University was the first. Iowa, Indiana, my own institution, the University of Oklahoma, was a land-grant institution. So, and these were, the federal government had an interest in these becoming institutions that would teach agricultural techniques and mechanical arts, as they called it at the time, which is a sort of rudimentary form of engineering. So in other words, practical, vocational education. That's always been a part of the mandate of the land-grant universities. And second, and more importantly, the rise of the research university. This was a German invention, really. The idea that the purpose of the university was not the transmission of the body of knowledge that had made up our civilization to the next generation. It was the creation of new knowledge through constant research, pushing back the frontiers of knowledge. That, if I heard that phrase once, I've heard it 1,000 times reading about this period, pushing back the frontiers of knowledge. So that, rather than the transmission of culture, which means things are organized towards graduate research, not undergraduate education. And then finally, the elective system, which means that instead of having a single prescribed curriculum that all undergraduates follow, they get to pick and choose what they want. There might be a sort of distribution scheme where you have to take one sort of non-basket weaving course per semester, but basically you could take what you wanted. And this was actually, Harvard was the place that led the way with the elective system. But this led to problems right off the bat, that it made the educational experience incoherent. Everybody was going off in different directions, doing different things. There was no common core, or no body of knowledge that was what everybody in the institution got out of being there. It was an incoherent curriculum. Even the disciplines didn't fastened together, didn't connect, didn't speak to one another. They were disintegrated in the strict sense of the term. And the end result was an education that pointed to a lack of meaning, a lack of moral meaning in the physical world, in the biological world, in the human world. And to top it all off comes World War I, which had a much greater effect in Europe than it did here, but was shocking. It still is shocking. We just celebrated, if you can call it that, the centennial of the armistice ending the First World War, and it is still just a shocking experience to go back and look at the way that war came about, which in a way nobody, even to this day, really fully understands. There's still so many theories about why the First World War happened. And it's this explosion, this self-immolation of Europe, into which the United States got involved later on. But it ended without any clear conclusion. The moral guilt for the war was assigned to Germany. Everybody knew that was probably not true, but it was a way of moving on, satisfying the Allies. There was a feeling among educators that World War I had been such a shocking outburst of barbarism in the part of the world that it considered itself the most advanced. It certainly was the most advanced in armaments and in a means of killing people. But was it advanced intellectually, morally? Otherwise, it seemed not. And so they were alarmed at this and thought this could in part be blamed on the disintegration of education, on the pursuit of means rather than ends that the modern research university and the elective system and the vocationalism had brought. So this is the environment in which the Great Books movement begins to take form. I noticed one book that's not on your wonderful reading list that I would suggest you might want to think about adding is a book called The Education of Henry Adams, which is about the great-grandson of the second president, it's by the great-grandson of the second president of the United States. And Adams, it's a beautiful book in describing exactly this atmosphere, although it was written before the First World War, but this sense that the medieval world had been integrated and had been unified, and the symbol of that was the medieval cathedral and the figure of the Virgin Mary. And the modern world, by contrast, was fragmented, and it was like it was in a centrifuge with different pieces flying off in every direction. And that's how the book ends. It's very, very evocative of the mood of the time. It was published in 1918, so it was right at the end of the war. So in 1920, you have the first certifiable great books program at Columbia University. It wasn't called that, it was called General Honors, which sounds like a sort of fake military title. There's General Honors over there. But it was a recognizable great books literature program primarily, and it was non-required. Really, John Erskine, the man who developed it, kind of did it as an add-on because it was something he really believed in. Students flocked to it. They couldn't create enough sections to accommodate all the students. This was at Columbia, again, as I think I mentioned already. And so this is one of the first sort of successful landmarks in the concept of great books education, that he didn't have a fully thought out philosophy of great books, but he was certainly tending in that direction. I'll move a little faster here. Chicago, 1930. Another example of great books thinking, the University of Chicago had a very young new president, Robert Maynard Hutchins, who was 30 years old when he became president of one of the great universities of the world, and he was concerned about this moral fragmentation issue, and he had a little bit of a religious streak in him, not an orthodox exactly one, but although he eventually did become a Christian, but he thought there was a need for transcendence. He would always express himself in those terms. So he and a man named Mortimer Adler devised a great books curriculum that they tested out at the University of Chicago. It didn't become adopted programmatically, but the idea was picked up by some people at the University of Virginia, lesser known names, Stringfellow Barr and Scott Buchanan. They formulated something called the Virginia Plan. And this sounds like something from the Constitutional Convention, but the Virginia Plan, it included math and lab and languages and all the other things that go with the great books at St. John's. And after trying to make it work at Virginia, after going back to Chicago and trying to make it work there and failing, as a last gasp, they tried taking over this little sleepy college in Annapolis, Maryland, right across the street from the Naval Academy, called St. John's College, a southern, kind of sleepy southern, enclave where everybody sat around drinking mint juleps and lamenting the decline of everything. And it was also a nearly bankrupt college. It was about to go down the tubes, and the Naval Academy was quite ready to snatch up that land and expand, because it was 1937 when all this was happening. I mean, the people in the Navy could see that a war in Europe was likely, and that the United States, at least the Navy, would not be able to stay completely out of it. So they were interested in expanding. But St. John's is rescued from that fate by these two men who bring lock, stock, and barrel this whole program and start it immediately in the fall of 1937. The whole thing, and the faculty has to either put up or shut up. They have to either transform themselves into tutors of Greek and Euclid and mathematics and lab, or else find a job in the middle of the Depression, which they were not likely to do. So they got off the ground, they got funding, they kept the thing afloat. And they established one of the most coherent and unified and sense-making integrated programs of study that has ever existed in this country. Now, I won't detail the rest of the history of St. John's except to say that it's stayed the course. It's pretty much stayed what it was in 1937. It's been successful. It's become the gold standard of great books courses. I wonder if we aren't at a top juncture now. This is something I want to plant in your thoughts, where the same kind of moral incoherence that people felt in 1918, 1920, people felt in the late 30s as they saw the rise of Nazism in Europe, as they saw the disintegration of the Western democracies. If we aren't at a moment like that now, in which the call of the great books as profound agents that shape the souls of students and not merely transmit to them skills that will help them to in the marketplace, but not tell them anything about how to live good lives and dedicated lives. If we aren't at a moment like that now, and which Torrey is perfectly situated to become a leading force in. There are a lot of other versions of great books programs too. And as I mentioned before, Thomas Aquinas College is not far from here, is a Catholic version of St. John's. They do Latin instead of Greek, and there are other variations, but it's pretty similar. What you do has a lot of similarities to St. John's. There's modified great books programs at many, many places, including Chicago and Columbia, Reed College, Notre Dame. Notre Dame has several great books programs. Baylor, Pepperdine, another neighbor. They actually have a great books major, I think. There's a great books, I know there's a faculty appointment in great books there. I think there must be a major. And there's the organization called the Association of Core Texts and Courses, or ACTC, not ACDC, as the faculty member said, "Oh, you're interested in ACDC today." Your faculty's very strange sometimes. So there's a larger base idea of learning here, that something about the idea of a core text, the careful study of a text, not a textbook, the opposite of a textbook, a text that is something that's viewed as having a standing and greatness and weight all its own, and that you approach with what I would call critical reverence or reverent criticism in order to see what you can learn from it. That it is a way of learning. It's a way of pedagogy. It's a way of teaching. And that's sort of the way I prefer to think of it, rather than that the great books do represent the essence of what's great in Western civilization. I think I prefer to think of it as a really great way of teaching young people how to think and to fill their souls with good things and the furniture of their minds being provided for. Some of the criticisms of this approach, particularly the gold standard St. John's way, the philosopher John Dewey thought it was ridiculous. That St. John, he mocked the St. John's program. He said it was not progressive because it doesn't recognize that we've learned a lot since Aristotle about chick eggs and about the things that Aristotle's known for observing. Well, yes, we have learned some things. We've forgotten some things too. But Dewey was driven by a progressive notion of science, and I don't mean progressive there in a political sense. I mean in the sense that scientific knowledge is always progressing, and what we know today about, let's say, the behavior of oxygen has invalidated the theory of phlogiston that chemists used before the periodic table came along. And in other words, science is always up, always moving up, and whatever is falsified or found inadequate is behind. So, when you take a chemistry course, they generally have a page and a half about what the idiots in the ancient world thought before we all got right with the periodic table and knew what was happening. They don't spend a lot of time reading older science. At St. John's, we did. We had a lot of older science, and actually, you learn a lot about the nature of science as a kind of inquiry by doing that. There's the contextualist criticism of the great books, which I've already talked about, that, it's superficial. You read these books out of no context, and you act as if Plato's in a dialogue with, Stephen Colbert, whatever. You can just jump across time and space, and it's a misleading impression of the past that things are not in dialogue with one another. You can't treat the history of ideas as just hopping from one mountaintop to another, as if only the tippy-top things in a given time are the ones that are worth studying and looking at. I think actually we've already refuted that idea, and what I've said up to now, that there's a possibility for a deep immersion in ideas when we look at the most substantial and rich texts in a close way. Specialists, dittos, like our friend who told us all about the Homeric poems. He had a specialized knowledge that actually was of no use for the task of reading this book together. And there are other criticisms, sort of identity criticisms, that the great books are too male, too white, too European. And, there's something to that, but I think it's actually easily dealt with, and that you don't have to throw everything out in order to introduce. You should always be rethinking the canon of works that you include in the great books. But one of the things I think all the criticisms miss is the role of discussion, or dialectics, as Plato would call it, the role of discussion as a process of discovery that is something that you generate yourself. It doesn't come out of a lecture. There are no lectures at St. John's. There's a public lecture on Friday night, which is more of a social event. The real educational stuff is no lectures. Do not have professors lecturing to you, ever. You have a lot of reading to do, but you don't have people lecturing at you. So there's a way in which the discussion-oriented format pushes you to have the experience of encountering with your own powers these great things that you're just as good as anybody else to encounter and read, and allow it to push your own intellect and your soul and your spirit to their heights. So you can do it. Yes, we can. And I wanted to read. This is a rather distinguished, if somewhat pompous, literary scholar named Harold Bloom. Some of you may know of. He has this book called The Western Canon, and it's about the great books. But he has something in here that I really loved. That I just came across. And he's a Yale professor. He's somebody who's read everything at least 3 times, everything that's ever been written. And he's his social skills leave a lot to be desired, but he's really read a lot. But he says, we're taping this, aren't we? I may get a hit job on me from that, the mafia. Okay. He said, I sat down one stormy night in New Haven, which is where Yale is located, to read once more John Milton's Paradise Lost. You all read Paradise. Yeah, okay, yeah. All right, I knew this would. I had to write a lecture on Milton as part of a series I was delivering at Harvard University, but I wanted to start all over again with the poem, to read it as though I had never read it before. Indeed, as if I was a Torrey student. No, he doesn't say that. But as though no one had ever read it before me. This is this really is what we did with the Iliad, my first seminar at St. John's. To do so meant dismissing a library of Milton criticism from my head. Well, I didn't have any of that, but which was virtually impossible. Still, I tried because I wanted the experience of reading Paradise Lost as I had first read it 40 years before. And while I read, the poem's initial familiarity began to dissolve. It went on dissolving in the several days following as I read it on to the end. It's nice to know it took him several days. That make you feel any better? But he read it to the end, and I felt shocked, alienated, and yet fearfully absorbed. What was I reading? In other words, he put aside all the scholarship, including his own, evidently, on Milton, and tried to just encounter the book as a Torrey student, as a St. John's student, as somebody untutored in literary criticism or historical criticism or any of the scholarly paraphernalia would do, and just encounter the text. And he goes on, let me just read a little bit. He says, weirdness was the overwhelming effect. I was stunned by the author's competitive and triumphant power displayed in the struggle against every other authored text, the Bible included, and the terrifying strangeness of what was being presented. Well, I don't know whether that would be my reaction, but what's great about it is that it's completely fresh and new and unmediated, and this is the kind of thing these books can do to you. You can be a guy who has, read it umpteen times in the 40 years since he's first read it, and if you can do the mental exercise of trying to empty your mind of preconceptions and encounter it once again, as if we were seeing it for the first time, it can produce phantasms and visions and all kinds of strange, weird stuff. And face it, in education, we're in the weird stuff business. So, so anyway, I wanted to share that with you. I think this is what we like for our students to experience, not the weirdness or alienation, but the sense of wonder at a book that almost seems to have a soul of its own, that has a variousness that you cannot exhaust. They are inexhaustible, these texts, and that's been proven not by some board of experts saying, okay, we give this check mark as being a great book. No, it's the fact that they bear up under repeated readings again and again and again. So his action was an isolated act of an isolated person, and then he writes about it. But I want to stress, and I'm kind of coming near the end of my remarks here, believe it or not, that the importance of doing that in a community. That's what you have here. That's what you have here. It's a precious thing. You won't have it when you leave here, by and large. To enjoy it, savor it while you do, because you have the experience of reading in community these astonishing works. I think the community aspect, getting back to educational theory, is really important. I think it's really important that we think about what kinds of communities we have to nurture the study of the great books. I don't think it'll do just to take any old arrangement and throw the great books at people, make a long list of them, say, here you go, and go to it. Now you got a list of books to read. That's not going to work. People need the experience of life together and of sharing those books together to begin to plumb their depths. And they need a community that has a lot of other things, ancillary things, like, again, I'll give you an example from St. John's. You have things like this here, I guarantee it. But at St. John's, the seminars where we read the great books are on Monday and Thursday nights at 8 o'clock, usually till 10 or 10:30. Sometimes they go on, They have to be done by midnight. There's some kind of city law that you can't, believe it or not. But so every Monday night, the bell of McDowell Hall, the main building on campus, will ring at 10 minutes to 8. People will come to their seminars. All of the freshmen will be reading, let's just say, Plato's Phaedrus or some Platonic dialogue. All the sophomores will be reading Augustine's Confessions. All the juniors will be reading Locke's Essay on Human Understanding, or something similar. All the seniors, the poor souls, will be reading Hegel. Do I get a witness on Hegel? The answer is, oh man. Yeah, I wish I hadn't even mentioned his name, but they're all reading these things at the same time. So everybody in your class is reading the same book that you're reading. Maybe not in the same translation. There's a little frisson of interest there. Oh, I have the Dudley Phillips translation. Well, I have the George Chakiris translation. So we all have these seminars, and then at 10:30 or whatever, we all pile down into the coffee shop, which is much too small to hold all the people who come in. So everybody's crowded around, and people say, what did you talk about in your seminar? What did you do? And the conversations go on and on into the night. So the Tuesday and Friday morning classes are often really, really soporific affairs because people have been up so late talking about seminar. But all of this stuff, the bells, the seminars at the same time, the coffee shop, you change any one of those things. And I'm not saying the college would, close it down, but it would change things. It would change part of that context, that community life that makes the books come alive for you. So I think these are very important things. They're very important to think about the ways in which you can build your academic study into your community life. And let me say, even though what I've just described at St. John's is beautiful, I really think a Christian institution is much better equipped to think carefully about how student life and the academic life of the institution can be brought together in a fruitful and exciting and interesting way. St. John's, when I was on the board, and one of the board members said, this is very wasteful to do. This guy was a businessman, and I'm told he's successful. I don't believe it, but he says, this is very wasteful because if you staggered the seminars, you could have twice as many seminars. If you did seminars on Tuesday and Friday nights, you could have twice as many students enrolled, and or you could have some seminars in the morning and some at night, and you don't need to have the bells ringing. That's not important. And people go into a state of shock because these are little bitty things that actually are corrosive of the community life around which the seminar takes place. So I think it's important to be attentive to those things and make sure that that the administrators of the university know that Torrey has its ways and don't mess with them. So the great books need to be studied in a way that's embedded in a community. And one last final note is that when we think about what we want from a college by way of a liberal education, what we mean by liberal education, really coming from the Latin, means an education for freedom. The St. John's has a slogan. It's a sort of a pun on liberos. I can't get it right in Latin, but it's basically, I make free men out of boys with books and balances. And all of those words have a liber root to them. That's the college slogan. It is a liberal education. It's a freeing education. It frees you to think as a rational individual about the things that otherwise would just be second nature to you, would be the things that you would take on faith without examination, on as the traditions of your family or the kind of presuppositions of the people around you. A liberal education enables you not necessarily to reject everything and kind of walk off in a huff like Holden Caulfield in Catcher in the Rye, but you can come to embrace them rationally and understand the rational basis for them. But one of the things that I think is consistently lamented in some of the best writers about college education today is the lack of a kind of search for meaning, I'll call it that. And one book that came out 12 years ago that really caught a lot of people's attention. It's by a man named Anthony Kronman. He's at that time the dean of Yale Law School. And the book was called, this title will get you, Education's End. Subtitle, Why Our Colleges and Universities Have Given Up on the Meaning of Life. And I saw this title, I said, I gotta have this book. This is what I've been saying and feeling for years. And I read it, I was so disappointed because, first place, he doesn't even seem to be aware of the existence of St. John's. It's not in the book anywhere, not in the footnotes, it's not in the index, it's not in the text, it's nowhere. But he states in the book, and this is, you have to get to about the middle of the book before you discover this. Well, it's really important to introduce the quest for meaning as part of the curriculum, but a course cannot involve religion, because the introduction of religion in the classroom that's a conversation stopper. When you let people invoke religious concepts, he's not talking about people saying, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. He wasn't talking about that. He's talking about people who use the Bible, use scriptural references, use theological text as part of the search process. He just rules it out completely. So, and I think this reflects something else, and this is my final comment, my finally charge to you is Torreyites. Is that what you call yourselves, Torreyites? What? I won't repeat that. You're pulling my leg, right? Okay. I've done a kind of informal study of programs, the sort of first and second year programs, freshman, sophomore programs that are meant to sort of introduce students to liberal studies. And I've noticed a pattern that courses that were created in the 40s and 50s, post-war era, to be sort of courses built around the notion of, our tradition, the Western tradition, the American tradition, the values we share. There's one course with that one, the values we share, have changed and morphed into these sort of search for meaning names. Like I'll just give you two examples. That Rhodes College in Tennessee changed their freshman course from the values we share to the search for meaning. The Eckerd College in Florida changed the Western civilization to the search for meaning. The search for meaning or actually the one at Rhodes is the quest for meaning. I'm sorry, the quest for meaning. So I think it's a little chivalric, the nightly quest for meaning. But this is a cop-out in a way, because it's a way of saying we're not really sure what we should be looking for. We just know we should be looking. So that's what we're going to do, is we're going to have a course in which we're going to valorize looking, searching, the questing, but without having any assurance of what it is we're questing for. I mean, it's better to be questing than not questing, I suppose. But if you're just questing off in any old direction and don't have the guidance of the institution, the confidence that the institution knows where it wants to direct you, the confidence that it's concerned for the formation of your soul, then you've not really put yourself in good hands. So, we always talk about how the joy is in the journey, but the destination matters too. And I'll close with a wonderful quote from G.K. Chesterton, which I hope that's a name familiar to you. Is he on your reading list, any of the in Chesterton? He is? Okay, yeah. What? Oh, okay. All right. Well, It's a good name. It's good man. Do you know the saying, Chesterton's saying about what is the point of an open mind? Oh, I have the quote here. If I try to do it from memory, I'll mess it up. He says, merely having an open mind is nothing. The object of opening the mind, as of opening the mouth, is to shut it again on something solid. So I think that's what you're doing here at Torrey, and I think you can take this process of study of great books to the next level, and it's something I encourage you to do, and I think you have the capacity to do with some of the great leaders you have here.
Discover who you're called to be at Biola University, a leading Christ-centered university in Los Angeles, with programs on campus and online. Subscribe for more of our videos and learn more at biola.edu.